Imagine that we have a renowned composer. What kinds of skills are required for her to be as excellent as she is? Certainly, she would need to be smart. She would need to have the right personality. She would need to be hardworking, and she would need to be creative. And also, there are probably some other things she needs to be able to do too. To be a composer, she needs dexterity, and she needs perfect pitch. And these might be added to the skills that she would need. Now, each of these skills would be part of a whole. For our composer, it would be quite important that she would be quite creative, quite hardworking, and quite smart, but maybe her dexterity doesn't matter quite as much. But if we imagined a cellist, her skill distribution wouldn't look like this. It would be different. Her dexterity is extremely important for her skill, and her creativity, given that she is following a script, might need to be somewhat less. And if we imagine a conductor, maybe his personality would be quite important because he would need to bring together a whole group of people to be able to collaborate. Each of these skills, a composer, a cellist, and a conductor, would be examples of talents. And each of their talents is composed of a set of lower-level traits. Now, if we focus in on these traits, we could imagine that each one of them could be represented by something like a normal distribution. If we take hardworkingness, for example, a given person is going to be located somewhere along some percentile on this bell curve. Now, if we imagine our renowned composer, it seems quite sensible that they might be at the upper end of this distribution. I want to imagine what would happen if we lowered them from the 98th down to the 20th percent. What would happen to our composer? I think it's likely that we just wouldn't have a composer anymore. It's not that they would be less of a composer, they simply wouldn't be one. Now, a way of thinking about this is that when this person dropped, they crossed some Nix Point, some location where it became impossible for them to continue doing what they were doing. Now, this point is likely not actually a single point, it's likely itself a function of the intelligence and the personality and creativity and many other characteristics of that person. That point would therefore not be a single point, but instead would be a band. But we might say for this person, given their set of traits, they would be, let's say, right here. Now, anything underneath that point we could call the Nix range, and anything above it we could call the working range. The Nix point might be higher than this, in fact, and it's possible it's also lower than this. It's hard to tell where it might be located. For now, let's just say that it's in the 50th percent. This would mean that for her, the likelihood that she has the hardworkingness that is needed to be the composer that she could be is 50%. Now, the same exact thing would be true of all of these other skills. Some of these traits are more important, and so some of these traits she would need to be considerably higher on, and others of these traits she would need to be somewhat lower on. Now let's say that we lay each of these on top of each other. If we do this, then there are going to be some skills that are lower, and there are going to be some that are higher. If we took all of them, especially for a very complicated characteristic that would have many, many traits that would need to be required, the average, if we took the average of each of them, would come out to be something quite close to 50%. And so, because of this, we can treat the whole, the likelihood of being in the right range for each of these as being 50%. Now, if we took each of these and we asked this question, in the population, how likely is it that a given person is going to be able to be a composer? The way that we might approach that is we could take this population, we take a random person from it, and we multiply the likelihoods of each of these traits together. When this happens, anything that is in the Nix range will be multiplied by 0, and anything in the working range would be multiplied by some positive value, let's say between 1 and 10. If this happens, then what we get, the product to the frequency, if we plot how often we get a certain number, we get something like a power law, and this actually has a name called the Lotka Curve. And the Lotka Curve, what it says is that as the product increases, the frequency of that product goes down. And what's really interesting about this Lotka Curve is that it actually represents a whole lot of creativity. So if you look at the number of contributions of a given person, there are a small number of people who contribute a huge amount. And there's a very large number of people who contribute a little. In fact, the mode of the contributions of a given person is 1. And this is not just true in science. It's true in the arts, it's true in history, it's true in a great number of fields. Now, this work that I've relayed to you here is inspired by the work of Dean Keith Simonton, who is one of the world's experts on creativity and on genius. Now, I want to use this to try to think about this phenomenon of the late bloomer. So with a late bloomer, you can imagine that this person, that every one of the traits that she would need in order to be a successful composer would exist. But there's some hidden trait that didn't quite work. And let's say that it happened to be free time. She simply didn't have enough time over most of her life in order to do what she could have done. But then let's imagine that for whatever reason, her life changes and she gains a whole lot of time. In that event, what would happen if we looked at her output? Over time, it would look like almost nothing happened, and then all of a sudden there would be a burst of creativity. All of these traits would have existed beforehand, but there was some hidden thing that she needed, her time, and that when that came in, she had a burst. Now, what this would suggest is that if traits are multiplied together to create talents, what follows from that is that there will be something like a creativity burst. Now, this has extremely interesting implications for artificial intelligence. Let's say that we have some complicated project that we want AI's assistance on, for example, a housing development. And you ask all of the questions that AI would need to be able to understand in order to work on that problem. It would need to be able to write and code. It would need to be able to understand policy and plan and engage in spatial reasoning and do all sorts of complicated forms of analysis. Now, each one of these traits can be located somewhere on a graph, just in the same way as our late bloomer. And if we focus in on one of them, let's take writing as an example. The improvement of AI's capacity to write has improved very, very substantially in a short period of time. And we might say that by this point, AI has the ability, simply the writing ability, to be able to engage in a complicated housing project. That is not to say that it has all of the other capabilities that it needs in order to be able to do this, but it does have the ability to write. Now, how likely is it that AI will be able to do these other more complicated forms of reasoning? If we look at how well AI does on a broad range of skills, including complex reasoning, code generation, math problem solving, general knowledge, it's increased very substantially. And if we were to plot these on a graph, what we might find is that not just but a few years ago, AI wasn't capable of doing any of these complicated tasks that would be needed in order to do this project of ours. But in a relatively short time span, actually an extremely short time span, each of these capabilities has been nudged up substantially. We don't know where the Nix level would be for each of these attributes. It's totally possible that it wouldn't be just the human level or average human level. Possible it would need to be higher than. But certainly, if each of these abilities is at the higher range of a human level ability, then we really have unlocked something quite powerful. So, as each of these gets nearer to the level of competency that would be needed in order to do our complex plan, each of these will be located along this little graph, and it won't look like all that much is happening. And then, when these last things come online, there will be what appears a sudden and profound burst in capability. Thanks for listening.